My dear one, there are moments that arrive so quietly, and yet they carry such weight that everything around them starts to feel different before anyone can even put words to why. Last night was one of those moments. Something shifted in the stillness. And even though no one has spoken a word about it yet, even though the morning looked completely ordinary on the surface, what happened during those unseen hours has already touched the heart of the person you love so deeply. You may have noticed a strange kind of distance lately, a pause in their voice, a slower reply than usual, a look that seemed present and absent all at once. That is not your imagination playing tricks on you. Some nights leave marks that words simply cannot describe easily. Some hours pass by, feeling like nothing more than ordinary darkness, and yet they return carrying thoughts powerful enough to rearrange emotions that had been hidden away for a very long time. Last night, while the rest of the world slept peacefully, that person sat alone with thoughts they had been trying so hard to avoid. There was no crowd around them, no noise, nothing loud enough to drown out what suddenly rose up inside their heart. A memory returned completely without warning. A feeling they believed they had already tucked away and controlled came back again, stronger than before, clearer than before, impossible to simply brush aside this time. They found themselves remembering conversations they had never admitted actually mattered to them. They replayed moments they once treated as insignificant, only to realize, almost with surprise, that those very moments had quietly become unforgettable somewhere along the way. A single small detail, the sound of a voice, a gesture, a sentence once spoken so lightly, all of it came flooding back together. And suddenly, the night no longer felt like any ordinary night at all. What changed everything for them wasn't some dramatic event happening out in the world. It was something happening entirely within. For the first time in a long while, they stopped pretending, even to themselves. That's exactly why the energy surrounding them feels a little unfamiliar today. That's why, even if their voice sounds normal on the surface, something underneath has grown heavier, deeper, more uncertain. Because when a person finally faces what they've been hiding from their own heart, they simply cannot wake up the next morning and be exactly the same person they were before. There was a moment last night when they nearly reached for words they have never once sent. A moment when they came so close to breaking a silence they had protected for far too long. Their thoughts moved closer to raw honesty than they ever had before. And although they stopped themselves in the end, the decision quietly forming inside them didn't just vanish. Something in them has begun asking questions they can no longer force into silence. Why does one particular person stay in their thoughts even during the quietest hours? Why does distance suddenly feel so much heavier than it used to? Why do ordinary memories now feel like signs they shouldn't keep ignoring? Those questions didn't disappear when morning finally came. That's exactly why today carries such an unusual weight for them. Because when a person starts questioning what their own heart has been protecting all along, change begins, slowly at first, but unmistakably powerful. The night didn't simply end when the clock moved forward into a new day. It continues living on through every thought they're carrying with them right now. Silence is exactly where the loudest decisions are quietly forming. On the outside, they may look calm and unbothered, but inwardly, they're standing right between two powerful pulls. One voice tells them to remain exactly as they've always been. The other tells them that after last night, staying unchanged might simply no longer be possible for them. That inner conflict runs far deeper than anyone around them could ever guess. Because certain realizations only arrive once in a lifetime. Some nights hand you only a single truth, but that one truth is enough to reshape every day that follows it. And last night gave them a truth they weren't entirely ready to face yet. Certain feelings never actually disappear just because they've been ignored for a while. They come back even stronger once the heart finally grows quiet enough to actually hear them. Even now, as the hours keep moving forward, they're carefully measuring their own words in their mind. They're allowing themselves to imagine possibilities they had previously refused to even consider. They're wondering whether the silence they've maintained all this time has actually protected them, or whether it simply delayed something that was always going to happen eventually. The person you love so deeply might not explain any of this right away. They may not even fully understand yet why they feel so different, but the difference itself is completely real. And sometimes the strongest kind of change begins long before a single word is ever spoken aloud. Last night didn't create something entirely new out of nothing. It revealed something that had already been quietly growing for far longer than anyone realized. That's exactly why today feels so unusual, and why what happens next might genuinely surprise even them. Something enormous is waiting for you here, because when someone's heart changes during a stretch of silence, the next visible step often arrives when you least expect it, and whatever they decide after carrying this particular night inside them may become impossible to overlook very soon. What happened after that quiet night grew even more unusual as the morning hours slowly passed. Because sometimes a person doesn't fully understand their own heart right away. They only start noticing that ordinary things no longer feel quite so ordinary anymore. The person you love deeply walked into today carrying thoughts they never expected to still be holding on to. Even the simplest moments felt heavier than usual. Familiar places looked exactly the same as always, and yet something inside them was responding to everything around them in a completely different way. There was a moment today when they paused for what looked like no reason at all. A brief pause, one that no one else even noticed, but powerful all the same on the inside. In that pause, the memory of last night returned once again, clearer this time, not as confusion, but as something they could no longer simply push aside. They tried distracting themselves. They tried slipping back into their usual routine, but certain thoughts kept returning with unusual strength and persistence. That's often exactly how genuine emotional shifts begin, not with a loud announcement, but through quiet repetition, until they simply can't be pushed away any longer. A sentence they once brushed off now sounds entirely different in their memory. A past moment they once considered forgettable suddenly feels significant. Even words they never fully answered now seem to carry a new kind of weight. What changed wasn't the past itself. What changed is how deeply they're finally allowing themselves to see it. And when someone begins viewing old moments through new eyes, they start understanding things they probably should have understood much earlier on. That realization is exactly why their expression today might come across as thoughtful, distant, or unexpectedly quiet, because inside them, something is still very much unfolding. They're beginning to ask themselves whether last night was simply a passing emotional wave, or whether it revealed something they've been putting off admitting for far too long. There are certain hours in life when people suddenly realize that someone has taken up more space in their heart than they ever intended to allow. They might not say it right away. They might even resist the realization at first. But once that understanding takes root, everything else starts connecting in ways they hadn't noticed before. That's precisely where they find themselves right now. A small reminder today made everything feel even stronger. It could have been hearing a certain name, seeing something familiar, recalling a shared detail, or simply sitting quietly long enough for the truth to rise back to the surface. Whatever triggered it, the feeling became impossible to ignore any longer. And now, what they assumed would fade away is instead becoming clearer than ever. There's another layer to why this matters so much. Last night didn't just stir up emotion, it also brought reflection along with it. They looked back further than they expected to. They thought about the times they stayed silent when they could have spoken up. They thought about the times they pulled away when they could have stayed closer instead. They thought about how often the fear of uncertainty ended up winning out over honesty. And for the first time, that kind of reflection didn't bring them any comfort. Instead, it brought a quiet realization that some distances form not because feelings were absent, but because those feelings were never expressed clearly enough in the first place. Today, while everyone else around them may see nothing out of the ordinary, they are quietly comparing what they used to believe with what they're feeling now. That comparison is reshaping their entire perspective. They're noticing just how often your presence has lingered in their thoughts without any real explanation. They're noticing how certain memories simply refuse to fade away. They're noticing that even after trying to move forward in perfectly normal ways, something unfinished kept returning to them again and again. That unfinished feeling became impossible to deny after last night. Once someone reaches this particular point, their next decisions rarely come from habit anymore. They come instead from whatever the heart has finally accepted as true. And hearts don't arrive at acceptance casually or quickly. It takes repeated reminders. It takes quiet, sleepless nights. It takes one specific moment that suddenly makes every hidden thought impossible to keep ignoring. That moment has already happened for them. This is exactly why they might seem a little slower today, more reflective, more careful with their words, more present in their silences than in actual conversation. Something inside them is quietly measuring whether what they've kept contained can possibly stay contained much longer. Something enormous is waiting for you because once a person starts questioning their own silence, real change moves closer than anyone expects. Even now, they're not entirely at peace with what they've discovered within themselves. Part of them still craves certainty before taking any action. Part of them still wonders whether what they feel should simply remain unspoken forever. But another part of them, stronger than before, is no longer satisfied with distance. And that stronger part was awakened by exactly what happened last night. Whatever comes next probably won't arrive with any fanfare. It might begin with something small, a different tone of voice, a delayed message, a sudden burst of curiosity, an unexpected openness that wasn't there before. These small things often show up right before bigger changes become visible to everyone else. The person you love deeply might still look completely familiar to everyone around them, but internally they are no longer standing in the exact same place they stood yesterday. A thought crossed their mind today that felt more serious than it ever had before. What if the silence has already gone on longer than it should have? That single thought is powerful, because once it settles in deeply enough, it slowly starts changing behavior, little by little. There's something even more surprising happening now. The further this day stretches on, the harder it becomes for them to return to how they felt before last night. What initially seemed like a passing emotional moment is turning into something far more permanent, more serious, and much harder for them to hide from themselves. At one point today, they tried distracting themselves completely. They moved through ordinary conversations, ordinary tasks, the ordinary sounds of daily life around them, and yet none of it stayed strong enough to quiet what had already been awakened inside. That's because once a thought reaches the heart at exactly the right moment, ordinary distractions simply lose their grip, and what kept returning to them wasn't random at all. It was your presence in their mind, only this time, not merely as a memory, but as meaning itself. That's the part they truly didn't see coming. For a long time, they may have treated certain feelings as temporary, something that would eventually fade if simply ignored long enough. But last night changed that belief entirely. Last night forced them to feel just how strong some emotions remain, even after silence, even after distance, even after all their hesitation. That realization followed them straight into today, like an unfinished sentence hanging in the air. Every time they thought they'd moved past it, it returned again. A single detail became surprisingly powerful. They began comparing how they feel right now to how they used to feel, and the difference became impossible to deny. Before last night, they could still tell themselves that nothing important had really shifted. After last night, that particular explanation no longer rings true for them. There are rare moments when a person suddenly understands that someone has quietly become part of their emotional center without any formal decision ever being made about it. No announcement, no plan, no dramatic event, just one realization that arrives fully formed and changes absolutely everything. That is exactly what they're facing right now. And because it arrives so unexpectedly, they're trying to work through it carefully. They're asking themselves why one particular thought keeps returning, why one particular person keeps appearing in their quiet moments, why certain memories now feel brighter instead of fading away, why a single emotional shift from just one night has stayed this strong throughout an entire day. The answer is becoming clearer to them than it has ever been before. There was another quiet moment today that mattered more than anyone around them could possibly see. They imagined what it would feel like if nothing changed from here on out. That thought didn't bring them any peace at all. Instead, it created a real discomfort, the kind that shows up when the heart realizes that staying silent may no longer feel easier than actually speaking up. That inner discomfort matters because it means silence is starting to lose its sense of safety. And when silence loses its safety, a person begins moving closer toward honesty. Even now, they keep replaying specific moments with unusual attention. Things they once overlooked completely now seem full of meaning. Words they once considered ordinary now feel genuinely unforgettable. They're discovering that some memories only grow stronger once the heart is finally ready to understand them fully. That's why today feels emotionally heavier than they expected, because they're no longer simply remembering, they're understanding, and understanding changes everything. The person you love deeply is standing inside a quiet turning point they never actually planned for. They may still appear composed on the outside, but inwardly there's real movement happening, slow, serious, and undeniable. Part of them wants certainty before doing anything at all. Part of them wants more time to sit with it. But another part has already accepted that something real was revealed last night, and pretending otherwise keeps getting harder with every passing hour. That's why their thoughts are no longer casual. They've become deliberate, measured, repeated, persistent. Something enormous is waiting for you here, because once a feeling survives an entire night, carries through an entire day, and still refuses to leave, it becomes impossible to label it as merely temporary anymore, and they know that. That knowledge is already changing how they see the hours still ahead of them. They're beginning to sense that whatever they've delayed for so long may eventually ask for a real response, not because anyone is forcing their hand, but because the heart simply doesn't stay silent forever once the truth becomes too clear to ignore. They're beginning to understand that last night may not be remembered as just another ordinary night after all. It may become the exact moment they later look back on and recognize as the true beginning of change. Because some nights don't actually end when morning arrives. Some nights keep living inside a person until they finally do something about what they felt. And this may very well be one of those nights. What makes all of this even more significant is that evening is approaching once again. And with every passing hour, the thoughts they've been trying so hard to control are becoming more organized, more direct, and increasingly impossible to dismiss. Sometimes the second half of a day reveals what the first half could only hint at, and that's exactly what's happening for them right now. Earlier they weren't sure whether what they felt last night would simply fade once daylight filled the hours, but now they know it didn't fade at all. It stayed. It followed them through every quiet moment, every pause, every attempt to move through the day like normal. That persistence is what changed everything, because feelings that keep returning again and again are never random. They're signals that the heart no longer wants to be ignored. A powerful realization hit them when they found themselves comparing today to so many ordinary days before it. They noticed this day doesn't feel ordinary at all. The same surroundings, the same routine, the same familiar world, and yet internally, something simply refuses to settle back into what it used to be. And suddenly they understood exactly why. Last night uncovered a truth they had delayed facing for a long time. Some connections don't weaken simply because they remain unspoken. Sometimes silence protects certain words, but it never actually erases what those words were trying to protect all along. That truth has become impossible for them to keep ignoring now. At one particularly quiet moment, they imagined hearing your voice completely out of nowhere. They imagined seeing your name appear somewhere unexpected. They imagined what they might say if honesty arrived without any preparation at all. That imagined scene didn't feel distant to them. It felt immediate. And that surprised them because people only imagine those kinds of moments deeply when their heart has already moved closer than their mind had ever planned to allow. There's another reason all of this matters. They're no longer only reflecting on what happened last night. They're beginning to connect it to so many other things they had previously ignored. Small signs from earlier days now feel meaningful again. Details they once dismissed now come back with new weight. A delayed reply, an unfinished sentence, a memory that lingered longer than it should have, a feeling they assumed would eventually pass, but never actually did. Now, all of it is starting to connect. And once those hidden pieces start connecting, people simply cannot return easily to emotional uncertainty. They also notice something surprising today. Even when they tried not to think too deeply about any of it, their mind kept circling back to one specific question. What if this feeling has already grown stronger than they were willing to admit? That question stuck with them longer than expected, because deep down, they already sense that the answer is closer than it's ever been before. They're arguing with themselves less about what they feel. Yesterday, they might have resisted the thought entirely. Today, that resistance feels noticeably weaker. That shift might look invisible from the outside, but internally, it's enormous. A person doesn't need some dramatic action to begin changing. Sometimes the real shift is simply the moment denial becomes too weak to hold up any longer. And that's exactly what's happening for them right now. Something enormous is waiting for you, because when denial grows weaker, truth grows louder, and truth has already started speaking clearly inside them. They're beginning to accept that last night wasn't some emotional accident. It was a revealing moment, one where hidden feelings rose up without permission and stayed without apologizing for it. That's why they can no longer fully return to their usual emotional distance. Now that distance no longer feels natural to them. It feels questioned. And when distance starts feeling questioned, closeness starts becoming imaginable again. There's one more quiet realization worth mentioning. They're wondering whether the next step always has to be something huge, and for the first time, they're realizing it might actually begin very simply. A softer tone, a different kind of openness, a small gesture, a new sense of attention. These are often the very first signs that someone has changed internally, long before anyone else even notices. The person you love deeply may still be carrying some hesitation, but that hesitation no longer stands entirely alone anymore. It now stands beside a growing sense of clarity, and clarity, once it's born, rarely disappears again, especially when it was shaped by a night powerful enough to leave an entire following day feeling emotionally different. That night is still speaking inside them right now, and whatever they choose to do next might come sooner than even they expect. Now the most unexpected part of all begins, because as this day reaches its final hours, what they're feeling is no longer just reflection anymore, it's becoming direction. A person can spend countless hours questioning their emotions, but there eventually comes a moment when those questions slowly transform into quiet decisions, and that moment may already be taking shape inside them right now. All day long, they tried to work out whether last night was simply a burst of emotional intensity or something far more lasting. But now, after every repeated thought, every returning memory, every silence that felt heavier than usual, one truth has become impossible for them to keep denying. What happened last night didn't fade with the daylight. It became clearer instead. And that's rare, because most feelings tend to disappear once morning arrives. But the strongest ones only become more visible with time. While the world keeps moving normally around them this evening, they're carrying a private awareness they never expected to hold on to for this long. They know that something inside them is no longer standing where it once stood. Even if they can't explain every single detail yet, they can feel the difference clearly. And that difference matters a great deal. Because once someone senses real internal change, they begin seeing their future in an entirely different light. For the first time, they're no longer only asking what happened last night. They're asking what happens next. And that single question changes everything. What comes next feels powerful, because they're starting to imagine what honesty might actually look like if fear finally stepped out of the way. They're imagining what might happen if silence stopped controlling everything. They're wondering whether certain words deserve to stay hidden forever, or whether the night that changed them arrived for a real reason. That question didn't surface lightly. It came after hours of resistance, after hours of trying so hard to remain emotionally unchanged. And now, that resistance has grown too weak to fully hold back what they're actually feeling. Something enormous is waiting for you, because this is exactly how quiet, hidden emotional shifts turn into real, visible movement. There was another quiet realization that came to them unexpectedly. They noticed that even imagining distance now feels heavier than it used to. What once felt manageable now feels incomplete. And that matters, because hearts only start noticing incompleteness once they begin longing for clarity, and clarity is exactly what has been steadily growing inside them since last night. They're beginning to understand that certain people leave marks far deeper than ordinary memory ever could. No matter how many days pass, some presence remains untouched by time itself. Some connections stay alive beneath the routine, beneath the silence, beneath all the hesitation, and last night forced them to fully face that truth. That's exactly why this day never quite returned to normal for them. Every single hour has carried that same quiet message. Something simply cannot continue on exactly as it was before. In the days ahead, there may be signs that even they can't easily hide anymore, a softer kind of attention, a more thoughtful pause, a sudden willingness to speak more openly, a different warmth showing up in moments that used to hold only caution. These kinds of changes rarely announce themselves loudly. They begin quietly, but they come from very serious decisions happening underneath the surface. And the decision now forming inside them isn't accidental at all. It's been shaped by every memory they revisited, every feeling they once tried to silence, and every truth that simply refused to disappear. Something enormous is waiting for you, because sometimes a single night becomes the dividing line between how someone used to feel and how they simply can no longer pretend to feel. This may be that dividing line for them. Even now, they're likely turning over one final thought in their mind. If last night revealed this much, then maybe the silence has already lasted long enough. That thought carries real weight, because once it settles in deeply, it begins changing behavior little by little. And little by little is often exactly how the biggest emotional shifts eventually become visible to the world around them. The person you love deeply may still appear calm on the surface tonight, but inwardly, they're carrying something entirely different than what they carried before that night began. They've crossed over from uncertainty into real awareness, and awareness, once it arrives, cannot be undone. Once the heart has truly seen something clearly, it never fully returns to not seeing it. That's exactly why what happened last night matters so much. It didn't just affect one single moment. It may quietly go on shaping everything that follows from here.